Massive thank you as always to our top tier patrons Sarah Turner and Alexander Lashley. For as little as $3, you can gain access to Patreon-only episodes, as well as access to our Discord server, where we host weekly live discussions with host Ikoi Hero and myself. So if you like what you hear, come join us at patreon.com/It's Not Just In Your Head. Please do rate us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on social media. We're on Reddit, TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And if you have any questions or comments about this episode or the podcast in general, then email itsnotjustinyourhead@gmail.com. This week, psychotherapist Harriet and substance abuse counsellor Ikoi Hero are joined by F.D.Signifier, an educator and YouTuber who has recently created an excellent series of video essays on the Manosphere. For the uninitiated, the Manosphere is a collection of websites, blogs, and online forums promoting masculinity, misogyny, and opposition to feminism.
In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
Can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
In terms of this conversation and sort of where to begin, because it's such a huge topic, and obviously you've spent hours of your life doing this already. It was sort of fascinating to me. Just a couple of hours before all of this today, I was on a phone with a female friend of mine, and she had to stop our phone conversation because this guy had just approached her in the street, and she was saying, I'm sorry, I'm on the phone. And then she was going, thank you. Yes, okay, thank you. And basically what had transpired was that he was attempting to give her a compliment, and obviously she sort of brushed him off, and then he wanted gratitude and recognition.
Oh God.
Yeah, so I was like, wow, okay, it sort of is fascinating. There's one thing sort of going up and maybe giving someone a compliment, whether that's in a public space or, whether that's even welcome to begin with, but then to ask for thanks. I was like, well, this is the Manosphere.
That literally doesn't make it a compliment. Like the whole point of a compliment is that there is no expectation of reciprocation.
Right.
It's complimentary.
Yeah. What it reminded me of is a very clever client of mine who, after the January 6th business, wrote an ad on Christian Mingle, where all those Trumpists go for dates. And she wrote, I'm looking for a man, a real man, a manly man who stops at nothing. Send a photo. And then she reported 22 of those rioters to the FBI.
That is a trap. That is well orchestrated. So yeah, I think one of the very interesting ways that you framed the Manosphere stuff is this idea that often gets put forward, which is that these figureheads ultimately care about boys and men. And and ultimately you ask that question, is that true? In some sort of summary, on the surface, what do you think the Manosphere appears to offer men?
Placation, maybe. It a little bit of a coddling. It's there's a lot of stuff there. How long can I talk?
Forever. As long as you want. It's all good.
So I'm going to just start. I'm just going to give you like a run of my thesis. Literally my master's thesis that I finished not long, or maybe about this time last year. I based it off of a lot of different research around masculinity, but specifically there's a concept from sociologist Michael Kimmel called aggrieved entitlement.
Yeah.
And what that basically comes down to is that patriarchy promises men, especially white men, a specific reward for performing patriarchy. And the subtext to that statement that I do feel like frustratingly gets left out of the conversation is that performing patriarchy is not some innate, easy process for boys and men. It's actually very dehumanizing. It's very self-mutilating. It is also compulsory. Mm-hmm. So we'll have, boys, I would say as young as 3 will start being, harmed by the requirement to perform patriarchy. And so, but we situate it as normal. And what we tell these boys when they're young is that you're going through this because it's going to make you a man. And being a man is awesome because it's going to mean all these things for you when you get older. So basically around middle school, a lot of these boys start noticing the hustle. They start recognizing that, well, no, they don't get the full hustle. All they know is that they were promised X for performing Y, and they don't see X on the horizon. And they see some other boys are getting X. And they're like, well, why are these boys getting X, but not me? And I think that creates, especially, I know this is kind of the core of the conversation here. This is especially relevant under late capitalism, where once upon a time, performing patriarchy effectively meant that you could be a man that could have a wife and be a patriarch of a household and have a job in manufacturing or somewhere else. And that job was secured and, pensioned and all these other things. That was true 50s, 60s, 70s. Not fully still to everybody, right? But true to us in extent that it was at least, I'll say, maybe reasonable.
And only for white men.
And right, but only for white men, especially, yes. A handful of black men got there, but we all always know that the wrong black move would end up getting you lose everything. So but that's still part of the discourse. So these boys started at puberty realizing that the hustle they've been swindled. And so at that point, there's an intense vulnerability. And what the manosphere and its adjacent elements does, because my video's goal was not so much to indicate which, right-wing caricatures of misogyny were on YouTube saying women bad, yada, yada, yada. It was more so to look at the elements that don't go that far, that are harder to identify, but still operate within the same status quo, within the same hierarchy of social structures. And so what the manosphere does, especially those early points, those fringe figures, is they come and they find that boy and they say, hey, you know what? I know you're going through this, and I'm going to tell you what, if it weren't for the Jews, if it weren't for black people, if it weren't for immigrants, if it weren't for queer people, if it weren't for women, if it weren't for all these other, regressive factors, you would have exactly what you were promised when you were a little kid. And, it's obviously seldom that blatant, but that is the subtext of that discourse. But they don't do that directly. The first thing they do is they say, hey, I know you're upset. I know you're angry. And then they follow that up with, you have a right to be angry. And then they feed that. And then it becomes a part of that individual's identity. And then it becomes a 3-hour long video trying to explain it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, go on, Harriet. Sorry.
I think a lot of that is popular in the media because it obscures the fact that capitalist America exported their jobs to low-paying countries with no ecological constraints and to computers and robots. And this is an alternative direction for the rage of being robbed a position, rather than looking at the culprits that are our corporate American culprits.
Exactly.
Right. Well, the aggrieved entitlement thing I think is really interesting, but I also, and maybe this is just being a douchebag white guy, thinking that actually part of the thing about being anti-capitalist is that there is aggrieved entitlement, that like, you stole my shit, right? You steal your sort of precious life minutes doing a job making profit for someone else, right? So I actually think there's a healthy version of aggrieved entitlement, which is that, I think we all deserve universal basic services, and we should be pissed off that resources are being sort of robbed from underneath us. So I don't know, that's sort of remixing the idea, or at least redirecting that rage. And
I I think that's possible. I think that does happen to an extent. When I hear that, though, I also know that there's a very comfortable the dominance framework that is a core component of patriarchy, right? That is also closely tied to whiteness, has to still also be dismantled. Because what happens is, especially when I think about, I call myself a baby leftist. I don't want to, because I'm only, I'm 40 years old, but I'm only, 4 or 5 years deep in identifying as a leftist as opposed to just a liberal, you know what I'm saying, or I vote Democrat. And one of the reasons for that is because my observation of the left was that it was very white and still operated within similar dominance frameworks. And so while I completely agree with you that entitlement rhetoric of we deserve certain
benefits for our labor.
We deserve these benefits for our labor is super important. The problem is when that becomes the recruitment strategy, then you find Western chauvinism replete through leftist discourse, at least online. Now, maybe in person, it's not as bad, but I tend to doubt that because I've had some engagement and I've talked to a lot of Black leftists who still see that. But, that's what makes it delicate. And so that's the thing. And that's the thing about the other thing I wanted to add to that. I'm sorry if I'm going off a lot here.
Go for it.
That your point there is true. And I think a lot of these people that end up in the manosphere would fully agree with you, but what they don't realize, or what they have that you don't have, is that they also feel like there is a hierarchy of who really deserves those basic benefits, who's really earned them. And it starts with whiteness and maleness, and everybody else deserves less for not having the white man's burden. You know what I'm saying? For the handouts that they're clearly given that went around. So it becomes sticky. It's tough to adapt that ethos effectively because, we have a nation, here in the US, but also still in the UK, of white males with no racial identity framework to pull from, with no concept of how white isn't a real thing.
Yeah. Well, that's a key point you make in the video very early on, or one of the videos, was just that being white and a man are intersections, right? And you make the point also that some people are just going to immediately dismiss all of that because of the language of the way it's described.
However,
go on.
I think it's important, as somebody who's very accustomed to being a leftist and has been a leftist for a long time, the point of the left is we've all been ripped off. Nobody more than Black people who have been property in our past. And there are some people holding on to that in, Jim Crow. So that we've all been ripped off, but we've been separated from each other through artificial barriers like color and gender and sexual preference. And only together will we win back our rights in our country.
Right.
And so I hope that a responsible leftist can get that across and can look at the manhood of someone like Malcolm X, who at the end of his life said, we've got to be all together. It's a class issue before they killed him. And the same thing with Martin Luther King before they killed him. But these were very sexy guys. So
true. And that brings up, that's something that that's probably I go in and out of explicit leftist stuff in my content because I want to be appealing enough, if that makes sense. I want to
where they're at, kind of thing.
Yeah, I want to meet folks where they're at. They can go from me to like people who are more explicitly leftist in their politics, because that's what I needed, And so you bring up Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and that's one of the biggest things I want to get into is how the left has been thoroughly, like America's leftist past was thoroughly eradicated during the Cold
Yes, during
And
McCarthy.
yeah, the McCarthy era. And like, I didn't really get, like, I'm just now fully understanding that. And that has numerous effects, right? One of it's just the fact that it's allowed us to slide further into, I call it diet fascism. And I don't know how long it's going to be on a diet in this country, the way we're going. But it's also made, it's made recovering the left and any type of leftist ethos in our politics and our social interactions so difficult, because I'm of a generation, I'm 40, so I was a child at the end of the Cold War. And I remember fallout drills. I remember hiding under desks because the Russians, I had plenty of anti-communist propaganda in my media. And I didn't know that Martin Luther King was hated because he was a socialist. You know what I'm saying? I didn't know that Malcolm X came back talking about socialism from Mecca before he was murdered. These are things that are completely unknown. And I had a uniquely pro-Black, radical Black politics upbringing. Like, as it's very, very, there's not too many people that had an upbringing like mine. Now, there's people that were more intensely brought up under that, ethos. But like, my mother, was involved with, Black Panther affiliate. Well, I'll say she's Black Panther affiliated because she was too young to really be in the streets like that. A lot of my family were involved in radical Black politics in Chicago. And I had no idea until relatively recently that the Black Panthers were a socialist organization. And I don't think I'm alone in that, And so, I say all that to bring up another point that is concerning about, I guess, the modern younger left, is that the left has become also an identity to a lot of young people, almost like counterculture, it makes sense because the left, you had a lot of, anarchist punk rock bands. You had that with involved within the political spectrum. You had a lot of art and culture involved with it. And so that's great because it creates maybe a hook for a lot of young people. But I think because the left is now dominated by the bourgeoisie whites who are under the age of 30, that creates limitations in its, ability to get back to being relevant on the national stage or the world stage, that we haven't contended with yet. We're happy, that it's like the heartbeat is back. You know what I'm saying? It's the ethos of leftist ideology is no longer taboo and immediately written off. Like, people are having overt conversations about communism and socialism, but it's also with, 24-year-old white kids that have never had a real job. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
so that's true. But the other part, which gives me hope, is that, as Martin Luther King actually said, the key to liberation here for all folks is the labor movement. And that's something that in the United States is going like crazy with its kind of non-explicit but totally blatant idea. We're all in this together. And if we divide ourselves by race, gender, sexuality, whatever, we'll lose. We're in it together because there's two classes, the employer class and the employed class. And most of us, in fact, the overwhelming majority are the employed class. Stick together, we'll win. That's Chris Smalls of the Amazon's philosophy. And that, I think, is this incipient class awareness that we desperately need, that isn't naive and bourgeois.
Yeah, like, I'm all for class solidarity. The thing that I fear is that you almost always hear within these groups, going back to that Western chauvinism thing I talked about earlier, class solidarity gets brought up too often when specific groups are expressing concerns. And like, that makes, like, you kind of like, that's the fearful reality of moving forward with these great divisions, is that, like, class solidarity should be an underlying axiom of the movement.
Yep.
And not be pulled up when, Black women, or trans people are explicitly voicing concerns about how they're treated in the movements. And
absolutely.
So
and then when those things are ignored, it then
those things
just builds up on what you were saying before, that there's implicit hierarchy, and it's like, oh, we don't have to listen to them. We just need class solidarity.
They're not really for the movement. They're just crazy. There's a lot of crazy, the crazy others. And that's the sad.
And on the other hand, there's the stupidity and backwardness of spending your whole meeting monitoring each other's microaggressions instead of trying to win, that there's both extremes, which are terrible.
Yeah. We need to give grace.
Yes.
That's one thing I've been trying to lead with in a lot of my stuff, because I'm coming in as a cis-hetero Black man who, I was brought up in the 90s, so like I probably as regressive a time period of the modern era as possible. And that was like native to me, the casual misogyny and transphobia of media at the time. And so like when I started kind of coming out of that in adulthood, right? Not like in my late teens or early 20s, like in my late 20s, early 30s is when I'm starting to question those things. You have the Me Too movement later on that really forces, I think, a lot of men to kind of sit and rethink the way they've understood the world. I'm trying to, so I preach a lot that, hey, I'm going to do something incorrect that hurts you because I'm coming from a space where that is completely normal for me. And I pray that you give me grace to recover from that when that happens, and understand that. When I do that, that is not my heart, that's my head, and I'll accept your correction. But please work with me on this issue,
Yeah.
But it's complex.
It is complex, but it's also simple, that we need each other, and we've got to treat each other with the dignity that we all need in order to win. Because they're winning because they have the money and power. We have the mass.
And they do not care about each other. They do not care. They have no concerns.
No, they have no respect for human life. That's for sure. Just like they said about the Japanese in World War II when I was a tiny kid. Oh, the Japanese have no respect for human life. And look at us now. We have to take this into consideration.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so in many ways, I guess the manosphere in general is not a force that's going to unite anyone, except maybe a bunch of men against everyone else, and
not even like most men, just like a niche, just these men that are, ironically most disaffected by capitalism. It's the ones that are most disaffected by capitalism that haven't had opportunities to reframe that recovery process that are usually most effective. One thing I point out, not so much in the videos, but when I wrote about this in my thesis, is that there's not a lot of popular, productive spaces for men, especially white men, that aren't still contingent on some framework of Western chauvinism or just outright patriarchy to begin with. They all kind of still hinge on that. So you can be a guy that's, you're disaffected, you're alienated, and you pick up, fighting, you pick up MMA. Boy, those MMA dojos are some of the most regressive patriarchal spaces you can enter. And so then you go there to January 6th portions.
Right.
Right. Yeah. And but there's that whole idea, isn't there, that, well, maybe not even idea, it's just the reality that part of male bonding includes misogyny, that's part of the sort of discussion you have with your friends, that there's always some, diet misogyny, even at best sometimes. And I think it's, yeah, I find it fascinating, this idea of power that sort of is central to a lot of the observations about it in general, and in your video. It's that sort of idea of, I feel small, therefore I'm going to make you feel small as well, as in directed towards women. The sort of fascinating insight, and one that I've recounted to several friends, was that idea that the incel community has got quite a accurate probably isn't the right word, but at least a sensitivity to social hierarchy. And that I thought the brilliant point that you made was that they don't want to get rid of the hierarchy. They just want to be the winners.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, it is grotesquely individualistic. That's what really struck me about your expose of the manosphere. Being a feminist and a woman, I've never been all that into the manosphere, but I'm appalled by its individualism, because it's the lie that you can individually, by swaggering around, compensate for a social hierarchy. That's so naive and stupid. It's like Horatio Alger.
Yeah. And that's I won't say the scariest, because I don't want to just even operate with that language. I feel like the extreme bad cases are often those who, even as they pursue these manosphere ideologies and don't feel any better, they fall deeper and deeper, which is where you start getting more and more dangerous.
Yes.
Because, it's no secret that I was talking so we had a spree shooting in Atlanta where I'm at, maybe earlier this week. And it came out that it was a Black woman. And I immediately told my wife, not a spree shooting like we think of it. She was like, what made you say that? I was like, because I'm going to just be real. The spree shootings as we think of them, as the spree shootings that bother us, that we think about when we go to the movies, et cetera, those are done by white men, by heterosexual white men, 99% of the time. And she's like, well, maybe this is one of the outliers. I'm like, maybe, but like, I doubt it. And so it comes out, this is not to absolve. I'm just kind of making sure I'm trying to illustrate a specific ideology involved. This Black woman had a problem with some people and went to kill them. That's what happened. She had a problem with several people. They happened to be in a public place. You can buy a gun at a gas station in Atlanta, and you can't really buy a gun at the gas station. But you get my point. Guns are readily available in Atlanta. Right. And so she went and she shot people in a public place. Now that does count as a spree shooting according to FBI laws that I think are purposefully written in a way to obfuscate the issue of white terrorism.
Right.
But it's very different than the last spree shooting in Georgia, where a white man just went to Asian spas because they contained sex workers and Asians, and because he knew they were vulnerable. Or the shooter in Illinois that just knew there was going to be a crowd there. What I'm getting at is that
it's random.
It's random, but it's very predictable, in that when you tell these young white men that the world is their oyster, and they find out that it's not, and they try. So for my thesis, I read the manifesto, so to speak, the diaries, the vlogs of numerous spree shooters, and they all follow a pretty typical pattern. They start out socially ineffectual. They are victimized as they're victims of bullying. They usually try in numerous forms of fashions to claim a sense of masculine prowess. Many of them try to join the army. They try to, improve their financial status. They do all these things to try to attain, like you just said, these individualistic, I'm going to swagger my way to happiness. Because the thing that's making me sad is just that I'm not an alpha male. And once I become an alpha male, I'll be happy. And first off, being an alpha male isn't even a real thing. But once they realize that doesn't change the dynamics that are really bothering them, that's where the resentment and the entitlement begins to skyrocket, and it becomes nihilism, and eventually outright, psychopathy. Why can't I talk? Towards society as a whole. And then they think the next thing is, well, I'm going to get revenge, and
I'm going to take power, because you get one of the things the U.S. foreign policy failed as it is, you take power at the mouth of a gun. And the media and the movies reinforce that, make my day. Yes. And they take masculine power, like the Bushmaster automatic that restores your manhood. That was the ad till got so much outrage they pulled it off. That was the does your wife? I've
never seen that.
Well, they took it off the air, but it was, does your wife or girlfriend make more money than you? Revoke your man card. Are you eating tofu instead of meat? Revoke your man card. And it goes down about 5 things, and then it says, restore your manhood, Bushmaster automatic, and has a big picture of the gun. And
Holy then they crap, I just looked it up. I did not know this was a thing.
This was huge. And they have a girlfriend target that you can get through the NRA, where every time you shoot her, she disintegrates in blood. And they don't have a boyfriend target. There is this restore your manhood. And since the NRA isn't saying buy a gun, make the gun lobbies rich, they say be a man. That also spurs these deranged individuals towards restoring their lost mass power, their lost male power.
Well, that's the sort of really corrupt thing about all of this, is that there is a knowingness. Like the people who did that advert, the way that all that advertising marketing stuff works is they identify audiences, they figure out like what they want or need, what their desires are, etc., etc., and that they could just plug into all of that stuff is exactly what has happened with all these particular figureheads of the manosphere, that they have they recognize that there is a suffering, and to what degree they're actually maliciously jumping on this, I guess, is maybe up for debate. But the point is that, and you see this a lot online, that there is clearly a lot of pain, right?
Yes.
And if you mock anything in the manosphere, they say, why are you trying to laugh at it? Clearly there's, men that are hurting and you shouldn't be laughing at them. And it's kind of maybe this is as a side, but do you think mockery works? Does that bring people out of the rabbit hole? Or do you think mockery just makes it worse?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. I give grace to mockery because I'm just a believer in gallows humor.
Yeah.
And I give grace first to the people who are oppressed. I try to preach empathy in a lot of my work, but I don't get into the habit of policing the resistance tactics of oppressed and victimized people. But I will outright say, mocking is more for us than them.
Absolutely.
Right.
So, the thing I try to do is, at least be aware this is not praxis. I don't like it when people treat their mockery and like their dunk videos as praxis. You know what I'm saying? Because it's like, no, praxis is so many other things. What you're doing is needed and useful, right? And like, I don't want, like I said, I'm not going to sit up here and read Fanon and Marx and Trotsky for an hour on a video. Like, I'm not going to do that. That's boring to me.
Yeah.
But I'm also not going to call, my video about Nicki Minaj a couple of months ago leftist praxis. You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm not going to call that praxis. So it's important for people to know the difference, I think. And I think going back to that whole identity thing, a lot of the young people, I've made a comment on numerous occasions that LeftTube or BreadTube, where I reside, is successful mostly because it helps 20-year-old college students argue with their shitty roommates.
Right. Yeah.
that is its biggest appeal. That is why there's a market for it. Now, thankfully, out of that, we can get, we can extract other value from that interaction and from young people's energy and willingness to move left, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't ever want people to think of me as anything as too much more beyond an entertainer who provides educational entertainment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And also inspires other people to question and act, you hope.
I hope. Yes, definitely.
Yeah. So I mean, ultimately, I agree. I think it's a good place to be, and I think you do it really well. I think there's a vibe, just in your videos that is everything that you've just said. It's ultimately compassionate, that you're creating a space, and that you're just like here to share some insights and some perspectives, and you're not like overly judgmental. So I think in terms of all that stuff, I think it works. And I think in going
really
back
quick,
to this,
I'm sorry. I don't know if you're going back to your point about them like gaslighting, essentially, about being mocked.
Yeah, just that clearly there's this as one of Ecoy's sayings that I really like, this whole idea of unmet needs, right? That there is a considerable amount of unmet needs in with men, and it can start with innocuous stuff that's just sort of annoying, like Gary V, just grind until you're dead kind of thing. And they become the gateway stuff for the manosphere. But then it can take, various different paths. And I think one of the things that's really interesting is that we recently did an episode with an ex-cult member. And one of the things that came out of that conversation was that idea that there is only one way of being in the world, that's often a thing with cults. And that it strikes me that the manosphere very much has a similar, very prescriptive way that you should be. And that should be a warning sign.
Yeah. You can go ahead.
No, it's all right. I think that talking about unmet needs is important, but the unmet need for domination is one of them we don't want to encourage.
Yeah. And the thing I try to give grace to for men and boys is that we're taught that domination is what we desire. So many men and boys just want peace. They just want, freedom, connection.
Yeah.
But the manosphere, but society tells them early on that what they need really is domination, as a masculine signifier. And as they practice that, once the manosphere gets to them, that is an axiom. That's tautological to them, that, whatever this is, it'll teach me to be a more dominant male, which will then make me happy. And when it doesn't, let alone the fact that not everybody can even present that. Like, some people are leaders. Some people have a natural charisma about them. Some people have a natural speaking voice, whatever. Like, if you don't have those things, you're never going to, air quotes, be an alpha male in the traditional sense that you're being, prescribed by Jordan Peterson. And so, when that's missing, it's hard to manage. And it also makes it really difficult. So one of the things I wanted to add to what you were saying earlier, Liam, was the only way to pull people out is through strong social support. That is, like, from the research I've done, and there's a relatively strong body of research around it at this point, is that what pulls these guys out the manosphere is stronger social ties, people, community, not just support. And this is something my friend, I had a close friend who's appeared in a couple of videos, Dr. Candace Nicole at the University of Kentucky. She said it's important to know there's a difference between support and community. So support is, you can do it. We've got your, we've got your back. I know it's possible. Here's a tool, a resource to help you along the way, which is still very important. But community, which is really gets really tricky, especially on the left, is, hey, you still belong here, even though you're in this state. You still are welcome here, even though your rhetoric, your attitude, your worldview is problematic or dangerous. And that's difficult because not everybody has that privilege. Like, I can't bring certain people to the communities I reside in because they represent existential threats. And there are certain communities that one of my most sobering moments where in my, I guess, political awakening to kind of move further left was I was working with an anti-sex trafficking agency. And I'm like 10 years into working with kids at this point and working with girls. Girls loved me when I was a high school teacher. Girls loved me as a mentor. Girls loved me as a step coach, a track coach, all that stuff. I never had issues with girls, never had issues with young ladies. I get to this place and I'm ready. I'm like, yeah, I'm here. I'm here to be the type of guy that these young ladies need to see more in their lives, yada, yada, yada. And I had one of the administrators, and I didn't even like this administrator in retrospect, but she pulled me aside and she said, hey, chill out and stay behind, stay out of sight when these girls come in. And I was like, why? And she was like, because regardless of your intentions, you look like they're abusers and you are going to have to slowly pace yourself into attaining a sense of safety and trust in their minds. And it was like, it was hard for me to hold that because I just knew what to do, right? I read all the books, I have all the experience, etc. But like, my innate, like just the innate space I occupy required a sense of deference to their safe space. And so, you know, that's a little bit out of where I was. But the point I'm trying to get at is that when you have these, when you don't have community and you're in the manosphere becomes the only community you're welcome in. And it becomes a matter of drawing straws. Who's gonna take the ex-manosphere guy into their community to help deprogram him? It's not gonna be me. Is it gonna be you, Harriet? Like you know, like are you guys over here in your queer commune on this side of town gonna do it? Are you radical black leftists gonna do it? Are you guys gonna take in the white manosphere guy? And it's like, so
yeah, patience and energy. That's rough.
It's tough.
Do you think, in regards to the strong social ties and this sense of maybe like an online community that happens with the manosphere, that part of the way sort of coming out of it is that if sort of taking the piss out of it is something that just doesn't work, you have to meet people where they're at. Are they only going to listen to men? Because there's this idea really that men, there was this thing being shared quite a lot on social media the other week that was, to paraphrase, just that men only listen to other men because they're the only other people that they respect.
I think there's maybe like a bell curve, a continuum there, a spectrum. So like those men deep in the manosphere, yeah, like the guys that are deep in it or even shallow in it, it's going to take somebody who they have shared identities with to pull them to a point where then they're ready to listen to other folks. And that's kind of why I've, even though I won't continue to do like this anti-manosphere content so much, why once I got to a certain point, I was like, okay, I kind of need to get in there because these, even though I'm going to say the same thing, like Mooncat, I don't know if you all are familiar. She did a manosphere video literally like the same week I did. I don't know how many views it has. Pretty sure it did well. But I know, like, I can tell by the way people talk about her video versus my video, that even though her video was better researched, more detailed, more explicitly about debunking and engaging with these manosphere talking points, my video is getting more traction among men within that space because here I am, a masculine presenting heterosexual man. People know I have children and I'm married, you know what I'm saying? Like, so they're like, well, his word and viewpoint I can believe in. And so like, that means it's incumbent upon men to not take the lead, right? But to be leader servants in that regard. This is a space where I'm uniquely qualified. Yeah. And so thus, I really need to step up and engage here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's a solidarity that a lot of men have even if they don't approve of blatant sexism, that they don't say anything.
Right.
And
Right.
your videos are part of the importance of calling it out on the part of men.
Yeah. And to be empathetic to their standpoint, this is a space that I've been challenged on, but I'm kind of still going to stand on it. I think we underestimate coming out of the academy. I don't know if the lore of my background has been put out there, but I was I'm ABD in my PhD program, and I'm not going to finish it just because I don't care enough. I'm getting enough money from YouTube.
Yeah, we did an episode on the education, the state
industrial
of education.
Complex.
It was really interesting.
But one thing I realized that took a little bit of my wind out of my sails in academia was, as I started getting into gender, there's just not enough about masculinity in, academic gender discourses. And that's, I think, just to be honest, because there aren't enough men or males like doing it. Because under no circumstances should there be a body of literature about a population where very few people of that population are contributing to the body. And so what I think exists here, this is why I'm such a big fan of Bell Hooks, because she was one of the few scholars that I thought got some of the reality of what it means to what the burden of patriarchy is. And how do you, I can't say patriarchy is a burden effectively to some people, because it's like what do you mean? Like, it's a threat to me. And it's like, yeah, well, that's true. And it's not a threat to me in the same way, but I wish it was more understood how that works. And that's how these manosphere people kind of get a leg up, is because they engage with that hurt, that space of hurt, in a way that a lot of others don't even know how to. And this is why men need to come to the front, because I know how it feels to be told not to cry as a little boy. That's a scarring. And I heard Liam take a breath there.
Yeah. No, well,
know how it feels. Like that was a trigger. You just got triggered there, not in the pejorative sense, but I know how that feels. I'm getting goosebumps now, having flashbacks to what it feels like to be deeply hurt or deeply in pain, and being told that my natural human response is not okay because of my gender. Right. And it's if you don't understand that innately, and you can't empathize with what that feels like, it becomes difficult to respond to it in the way that is necessary. Just like you all can't understand necessarily how it feels to be a Black man in America, or I don't know what it feels like to be a woman or a trans woman, or on a whole spectrum of identity. And so I really just want other, men, whether it be trans or cis, to engage in the recovery process of some of these men and boys, because it's going to require the perspectives that we understand to make it efficient,
Mm-hmm. Plus
your very active compassion, and interest defies the stereotype. And that's very important. If a man is listening and asking questions and sitting in compassion, even if he's different and he doesn't like the end goal, that very act of compassionate listening is a departure from the patriarchal norm, and is an important one, even if it's inexplicit.
Yeah.
It's interesting, this idea of mockery, because obviously Jordan Peterson's very famous for crying all the time. And it's one of those things where you see people take the mick out of it, but it's also one of those things that is something, it sort of proves the point in some way. It's like, well, you're taking the piss out of a dude who's crying. What's wrong with that?
Right.
And Elle, one of the patrons, had made a point also about, he said, I really appreciate in one of your videos that you called out one commentator who made a homophobic joke about Kevin Samuels, we have to be careful to not lean into the same toxic values we claim to be against.
Right. Yeah. I read a tweet this morning that said the gist of it was, it bothers me when people use words like justice or accountability when what they really mean is revenge. And I think that's a tough, like, there's a tough space we're in where, Paulo, Pedagogy of the Oppressed author's
Paulo
name
Freire.
Thank you, Freire. I was like, how do I say that last name?
I think it's Freire.
Yeah.
I keep wanting to say Friar, and I know that's not Friar.
Yeah, I was about to say Freire, and I think that's even less close. He made the point that it takes the essentially the benevolence of those in oppressed positions to kind of use that strength to fix the problem, because the oppressors are never going to give it up willingly. And if those in oppressed positions don't find the right balance in their action in their resistance, they risk becoming oppressors. Now, I'm not afraid right now of being oppressed by women or by LGBTQ people. Like, I don't think we're there. But I do think there is a element of truth to the fact that the hurt that has been experienced by women and by, queer people and by others, by some of these institutions and these people, has muddied the waters on the difference between restoration and justice and get back,
Yeah.
And how do you tell a person that? Like, that's a difficult, I think we're getting closer to that space as these discourses have re-entered mainstream. I think there was kind of like it's kind of like you take a really fresh bottle of soda and you pour it in a cup. So I would say the last 4 or 5 years is like that moment where it fizzes to the top. And that's the discourse right now. The fizz is maybe simmering down where we can have slightly less high stakes, slightly more nuanced ways of addressing these problems. And you don't just want to, because I can imagine wanting to say something homophobic to a man that is treating you shittily, because that will hurt him, right? That that's what the patriarchy does to men. That if I question this man's manhood, that is a way I can weaponize his gender in the same way he weaponizes mine against me. And it's an effective strategy, but it also reproduces the same problem at the end of the day, and stigmatizes your queer peers, It
does. And there is this need. I had it too as an early women's liberation person in the late 60s. And then I had already gone beyond that when I went back to the Women's Liberation Center, because I wanted to get them to support midwifery rights at Yale New Haven Hospital. And they had a big poster of an astronaut, because it was around the time that the man went to the moon. And it said, they took one man to the moon, now they could take the rest of them. Because there's a normal, it was cute, but there's a normal thing. We have been excluded, now we'll exclude you. But then the whole relationship is skewed, that you're not in it together. And I have found in talking to people that we're in it together and we need each other to win has been helpful. Rather than you excluded me, now I can discriminate against you. And the whole dynamic of discrimination lives on.
And this conversation continues on our Patreon. So why not join us over at patreon.com/It's Not Just In Your Head. Massive thank you as always to our VIP patrons, Alex Placito, Bruce Rogers Vaughan, Jennifer Cox, Justin Harper, Rebecca Johns, Seamus O'Connell, and Sheena Belmas.
If you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
And you can hear more from Harriet on her radio show called Interpersonal Update. It's on WBAI at 2:30 EST on Wednesday afternoons and in the WBAI archives.